For once in all my time at Virginia Tech, it feels warmer inside this room than it is outside. I guess they probably changed for AC system in here. But I got two coats just in case. I put this slide here to remind myself at the outset to introduce myself. I'm not sure how many of you know who I am, so just a quick show of hands. Who knows who I am? Oh, okay, good. Well, I don't need that then. I was just going to tell you what I do here, which is I teach history theory. I also run the run programs. Quick plug, if you're interested, I'll be running one next year as well. I'm also starting to run graduate level history and theory in school, or contribute to that, I should say. We've got a new Master of Science with a history theory concentration, which I would encourage you all to think about potentially taking after you graduate as a beginner. But something I don't normally tell people about is my research, which I put a lot of time into, but you don't necessarily get to see it. So these are all the writings I've been doing in the last, 8 years. So this article, In Front of Lives That Leave Nothing Behind, offered an intellectual biography of Robin Evans, focusing on how his ideas about domestic life and privacy framed his studio education. I recently published another follow-up to this called Robin Evans, His Empty Room, Collective Living in the 1970s, which developed this further, and I hope to eventually make a book on Robin Evans. Notes on the Meaning Moment was about the ideological conditions of discourse in the 1960s. The Cambridge Collage focused on the material dimensions of drawing and how they interact with philosophical ideas in architectural education. The Heterotopias of Tafuri and Tissot was about the reception of Foucault's writing in architecture in Italy and in America in the 1970s, and about the political conditions surrounding its reception. In The End of Theory of the Division Between History and Design, I looked at the institutional conditions inside universities behind the rise of doctoral studies in architectural history. Writing and teaching architectural history in the second machine age examined media technical questions around education. It looked at the BBC's use of television in the 1970s to teach architectural history to a mass audience. And Instagram Indifference and Post-Critique in US architectural discourse addressed how theoretical discourses have changed in the last 20 years as a result of social media and the effects of image-based means of communication on architectural thought. So I've recently put all this stuff up on newacademia.edu page, so if anybody's interested to read the stuff I write, you can download it for free from me. One thing that's not up yet, because it's not out, is my research, which is called Vesley's Lesson, The Promises and Problems of Phenomenology for Architectural Education. And fingers crossed, this should be out next year. So in addition to this more scholarly research, I have also founded a non-profit charity dedicated to architectural education called the Architecture Exchange. It's an online platform that seeks to foster architectural discourse through a series of different formats. So its flagship project is a series of conferences that seek to catalyze debate between the world of critical theory and architecture. I've held 3 conferences with these 3 critical theorists, and each one became a book. And if anyone is interested, there's a talk happening at RPI in April this year with the theorist Giussi Parita. And so the ambition is to make at least 8 of these conferences that become a book series. The Architecture Exchange also has an audio journal, I call it. It's effectively a podcast, but it focuses a number of episodes on a single common theme. that all get released at once. And the one I'm working on right now involves a series of interviews I did with contemporary practitioners, many of which I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of the work they've done. And finally, the last thing that I'm doing with the Architecture Exchange is to launch a new online video platform called Architecture Exchange Discourse, which will serve as a teaching and learning platform for faculty and students to engage with the ideas that shaped the architectural culture in the last half century. So it will contain interviews that I've done with architects, historians, theorists, and critics about their lives, their work, and their contributions to the field. So these are the first 70 that I've completed so far. And it will also contain a growing series of discussions between a group of over 100 architectural educators discussing key topics. So this is the group. And they're discussing the places, people, events, books, buildings, movements, and ideas that have formed the discipline. So far we've done these 40 dialogues. We plan to do many, many more, and they'll all be available on this platform. So that's a brief introduction to me beyond only my teaching in school. And if you're interested in following what I do, I use my Instagram account as a professional platform, basically a kind of LinkedIn or a place where I blog everything that I'm doing. So you can follow that to see what I'm doing. So, today I want to talk about some contemporary trends in architecture. I'm going to talk about the work of some of the architects I've recently been interviewing. They are located within academia and trying to develop a practice, though not in the sense of a conventional professional practice. Given the freedoms that having an academic salary allows them, they're all attempting to make work which contributes simultaneously to what we might call either the discipline of architecture, architectural culture, or academic architectural discourse about architectural form and aesthetics, for want of better words. So, the people that created all of these projects have already been somewhat gathered together as a group by a series of critics and curators in books and exhibitions over the last 10 years. So there was the Possible Mediums workshop at OSU in 2013, the Delight Symposium at Princeton in 2014. In 2015, there was the Chatter exhibition in Chicago, along with the Treatise series curated by Menes Lai for the Graham Foundation. In 2017, there was the Make New History Biennale in Chicago, which had a lot of these people involved. And then the Possible Mediums workshops came out as a book that year. Michael Meredith published a widely read essay called Indifference Again, which named many of these practitioners as part of a group with shared interests. And there was an A+U special issue on emerging architects in the United States, which focused on 6 within the group. 2018 was a big year for consolidating something of a group here. There was in January the Inscription Show at Harvard, curated by Andrew Holder and Michael Hayes. Then in February, the Becoming Digital Conference at Michigan. Yale held a Tempietto exemplar conference and exhibition in April. And then Michael Meredith exhibited an exhibition called 44 Low-Resolution Houses in Princeton in September to November that year. And after this sort of flurry of events, there were a number of books that came out following up. So the Inscriptions exhibition became a somewhat monumental book, very large in size. And that was published in 2022. And then after that, Karen Miller and Molly Hunker, and Karen Miller had recently published Possible Mediums, then came out with another book called Building Practices, which interviewed a lot of people in this group. So, if you list the practices in these exhibitions and books, you see the same practices frequently appearing in all these different curated projects over a 10-year period. And you see collective efforts to try and frame and interpret this shared body of work. So to some degree, as to the question of how did I choose who to look at, my answer is simply, I'm looking at the people who are already looking at each other, or that the critics and curators are already looking at. So I've been interested in this body of work for a while, largely because I find it exciting to see these kinds of aesthetic and formal developments being pursued in architecture, and particularly ones that I see as relating to larger material, technical, cultural shifts that affect architecture. So I'll share some trends within this body of work, and they are materiality, affect, fabrication, installation, discreteness, legibility, character, dumb composition, the slightly off, low construction, and familiar. So firstly, materiality. This trend goes back to the late 1980s, when the field shifted from a general interest in language to an interest in materiality. So in place of post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, semiology, all theories of language, you could say, architects began reading materialist philosophy and the history of science. Roland Barthes was out, and Jacques Derrida was out. Gilles Deleuze and Bruno Latour were in. As the field of architectural history has professionalized and moved away from architectural design culture, scholars within schools of architecture have also adopted the largely empirical methods of history and have become less interested, I would say, in such things as ideas, intentions, and meanings. So the first thing to say about the new materialism or empiricism is that it's been a reigning intellectual paradigm for around 40 years now in the domain of history and theory of architecture, at least since the high theory moment of the 70s and the 80s came to an end. But let's look also at how it emerged as a discourse within architectural design as well. For a while in the 90s, computers only had enough power to process vector-based data with B-spline curves. And so rendering engines produced only this immaterial, metallic, shiny, and smooth look. Because the internet and the idea that we were moving into an information society was prevalent, everyone was talking about the virtual and cyberspace. So by the early 2000s, there was a desire to counter this narrative. Sort of cultural swing took place, to talk about something new again. And so people started playing around with the analog and the material once more. Jason Payne was one of the first graduates of Columbia's infamous paperless studio. The paperless studio was infamous because they polemically threw out all of the drawing boards and installed a very expensive animation software on computers, software like Soft Image. Initially, the software allowed people to simulate movement and flows, but it could not yet simulate physics. But when Jason Payne began working with the new particle simulators and physics engines that became available in the early 2000s, he began arguing that the digital project had to consider material behavior in a way that it never had. Mario Carpo has argued that the increase in computing power across the last decade that has enabled the shift from vector-based modeling to now the ability of computers to handle enormous point clouds has inevitably led to a new kind of aesthetic, one of grainy, textured, mottled surfaces that inevitably are associated more easily with the messiness or the irregularity of material life in nature. The early 2000s was also a moment when the availability of fabrication tools like laser cutters and CNC milling put pressure on the digital avant-garde to work out how exactly they were going to fabricate these complex forms. And thus, this focus on analog material processes emphasized how matter actually had its own agency. And that such things as chaos, chance, entropy, and serendipity that were part of material behaviors had to be taken into account in the design process. But more than that, this new generation around people like Jason Payne and his students at UCLA were using these kinds of things, chaos, chance, entropy, as a potential design tool. They began rejecting rationalization, optimization, and control, and using the messiness of material behavior to create purposely non-optimized forms. Many began looking back at the art practices of the 1960s for inspiration, and began seeing materiality no longer as a means to solve problems of structural viability and efficiency or economy, but as a means to create new aesthetic effects and qualities, and new qualities in buildings. So around the late 2000s, you started to see student thesis projects in some schools that were based on funny, messy material experiments, piling up materials, aggregates and rocks and random things, playing around with spaghetti, or hacking plotters to make them drip sand onto surfaces. And a lot of contemporary work, all of this coming out again of the students of Jason Payne at UCLA, was based purposefully on messy, slumpy, poor-performing, and non-optimized material processes. So this optimizing exploration of material qualities dovetailed with another trend coming out of the late 1990s and promoted, again, at places like UCLA, but also Yale and Princeton, which is affect, with an A. After all the talk about technique and performance, some people wanted to talk about experience again, and how people used buildings or how buildings made them feel. Figures like Bob Sommel and Sylvia Levin and Jeff Kipnis pushed the idea of affect through writings like The Doppler Effect, The New Moon, and Kissing Architecture. At UCLA in the 2000s in particular, there were heated debates about how the digital could become more sensuous and affective through the exploration of material effects. With these weird experiments with matter, and with people looking at informal art, affect also took on negative feelings of horror, the abject, and the grotesque. People like Michael Loveridge, who was a student of Jason Payne at UCLA, started to develop strange-looking body parts and ambiguous things that were partly human, partly animal, with hair and skin that evoked horror. Part of this materialism also involved a turn to fabrication, as I mentioned, in the early 2000s, and making things at a one-to-one scale in schools of architecture. The groundwork for this was laid in a period when people wanted to fabricate the new forms they were making with the computer. Annual competitions to build pavilions, such as those of Brett Steele and Patrick Schumacher's Design and Research Laboratory at the Architectural Association in London, or for the MoMA PS1 in Queens, in New York, became opportunities to demonstrate how fabrication tools could bring the new digital forms into the world. There was an optimism in the early 2000s about how the whole construction industry was potentially about to change radically. Architects thought that perhaps they could even cut out the contractor entirely and fabricate their own complex forms themselves. Schools such as Michigan and SciArt built the first dedicated fabrication labs in the late 2000s, but as fabrication became more commonplace in schools, it no longer felt so avant-garde. Things coming out of the fab labs tended to all look the same after a while, technology determined design too much, and it was just not as culturally or as artistically as interesting. Today, digital fabrication has become an enormous academic subfield in its own right. And it's about architecture faculty doing smaller prototyping experiments that are more reliable measures of research output, so they might secure tenure in today's innovation-oriented universities. So what began as the pavilion, used as a means to prototype and demonstrate the ability to fabricate complex forms, shifted to a culture of the installation, which had much more to do with the art world and with public art and public sculpture. Now the venues, by around the late 2000s and 2010s, were galleries that began opening for art and architecture. Galleries like Materials and Applications in Los Angeles, or art residencies such as Ragdale, or music festivals like Coachella. These venues and their audiences necessitated that these installations be about more artistic dimensions of the project, things that engaged audiences and were about meaning and more than just proving the fabrication of forms. And this also explains the shift from smooth forms to discrete and chunky forms, which is my next category. Another trend that lays at the intersection between new materialism and the new artistic sensibilities is the treatment of composition in a more discrete manner. The trajectory of smooth digital work had reached its peak in the work produced by Zaha Hadid's office in the early 2000s. Work that Giorgio Canici probably worked on, sorry guys. It was an incredibly successful period for the office of Hadid architects, building things all around the world. And the game was won to some degree. The parametric had tended towards fluid and curvaceous singular objects, ducks, as Venturi once called them. So these iconic duck-like forms of object buildings by now were being built all around the world in global cities trying to cultivate tourist economies by so-called star-architects. And they appeared increasingly complicit with the globalized neoliberal economy that became so exuberant between the mid-1990s and mid-2000s. The reaction, which accelerated after the crash of 2008, was to see such smooth and organic forms as having been complicit then with an economy and style of government that was now widely seen, within the academy at least, as having failed everyday people. The post-crash decades of austerity thus birthed a new aesthetic sensibility that shifted towards a new small-scale language of affordable houses made up of broken parts and awkward, inefficient forms. I should say, though, that this new language of discreteness can be seen initially, before the crash, in the approach to composition in offices like OMA and Bedford and Mura. Rem Koolhaas of OMA had long argued that there was no relationship between form and use, or between form and construction. So instead, form emerged as an irrational consequence of a program taken to its absurd limit. When massing it at a big scale, this led buildings in the early 2000s by OMA to take on all kinds of shapes, and among these shapes were a collection of projects in which form became scattered and discrete. This was the same for Herzog and Meuron by the mid-2000s, who had abandoned their careful articulation of the box in their early career and begun to operate much like a Dutch practice in the model of OMA, making any kind of form, often at a very large scale. And buildings as collections of discrete forms were among these many formal experiments that they engaged in. The idea that a building is broken down into fragments, and each fragment has its own autonomy, its own personality, its own soul even, also relates this trend of discreteness to the idea of character, though character also sprang out of the idea or discourse of legibility. And these in turn sprang out of the discourse of affect. So, legibility first, then character, and all these are born of affect to some degree. Rather than buildings having once been understood as communicating complex meanings, which might have been common during postmodernism in the 70s and the 80s, meanings that required difficult cultural and historical interpretations, they were now to be thought of as having fast and powerful graphic impact upon those who encountered them. Bob Sommel was looking at OMA's work and theorizing the powerful marketability of this kind of instant recognition. He admired the way that the diagrammatic massing of OMA's work effortlessly led to shapes with clear outlines and profiles, the value of which was their clear legibility. They did not require reading or deciphering. They hit the optical retina instantly. Sorry, I should have been on that slide for this. This is his article, 12 Reasons to Get Back into Shape, which looked at the work of OMA specifically. Again, this was being explored also by firms coming out of Holland, such as BIG and NBRDV. Once form was no longer truthfully related to tectonic expression or rational structure, form was free to be purely visual and affective. One way that legibility was explored was through abstract geometric figures that served to organize buildings formally. These figures had a graphic legibility, but they also functioned as formal diagrams. Though this said, I think the diagrammatic aspect of legibility really belongs more to the 1990s than it does to the contemporary trends I'm unpacking at the moment. But another aspect of this exploration of legibility was the return to kitsch and semiotic forms of figuration, but again, without so much of the hermeneutic baggage of postmodernism. So this had already been signaled in the work of FAT and NBRDV in the early 2000s. Firms that argued that anything goes, regardless of how superficial it looks, because the colorful, playful, and recognizable nature of these forms would enable engagement with users and audiences in new ways. The younger generation working today are working with abstraction, Gestalt principles of perception, and the complexity and multi-coded nature of profiles and shapes, but they're also working with this popular, cute, playful, and kitschy dimension of legibility. And this latter dovetails with the theme or trope or trend of character. Character has been a dominant idea in architecture for many hundreds of years. It was particularly dominant in the late 18th and 19th centuries, as architects felt that their role was to imbue qualities in buildings. They felt that giving character to something as an architect, and they felt that it was possible for an architect to freely choose the character for a building, to characterize it as either Indian, Saracenic, Gothic, classical, or if it was, in the case of the Ledoux, if it was the home for a lumberman, it would look like a home for a lumberman. But they also felt that the outward expression of the object that had been given character then communicated what it was really about inside. So the concept of character is about the outward appearance expressing the true inner nature of something. Or that there's something inside that is being expressed in the outside. There had been a renewed interest in this also during the 70s and the 80s, when architects were criticizing functionalist modernism and playing with the idea of character again to try and imbue buildings with personality and meaning. But today, character for this generation was born out of experiments also with materiality, as much as the explorations with the graphic. New materialism and object-oriented philosophy in particular suggested that objects had a certain subjectivity to them. The things that were being made were seen to be creaturely, animate, spirited, and with variously either horrifying or cute characters. So, in place of the smooth and unified forms of stylistically parametric architecture, like that of Zaha Hadid, we have this range of new kinds of discreteness from fields, from casual piling, from autonomous parts, and now also from objects that we think of as being their own autonomous subjects. And just as the new materiality led to the trend of the purposely uncontrolled, awkward, and non-performing, so too in the realm of composition, the new discreteness led to the unscripted, the casual, the childlike, the haphazard, the random, and what many call the dumb. So playing with analog blocks and models in the studio, moving them around by hand, photographing them in different ways, becomes a way to very precisely calibrate a project and to create a sense of seeming casualness, a sensibility that actually affects an overly sophisticated knowingness within the work. So this overly sophisticated knowingness, I want to link to a trend I'll call the slightly off. There's an attitude today in which things are almost something, but not quite. They're a bit off. They're off alignment, they're off kilter, they're off axis, they're off even in the sense of saying, like, that's a bit off in response to someone telling a bad or inappropriate joke. That's sort of morally a bit off, you could say. There's a tendency to reference something, perhaps a geometric figure of some kind, or a recognizable form, and then slightly twist, swerve, or alter the form in some way. So the clearest example of this is in the design of single-family detached houses, where the pitched roof is a figure that is recognizable and then can be tweaked, shifted, exaggerated, distorted, and so on. The tools to tweak these recognizable forms are largely rooted in a new ubiquity of Boolean modeling, massing in digital software like Rhino or Meshmixer, or literally and easily manipulates, distorts, deforms something, or maybe blends two things together and mixes the way that they merge together. And in doing so, it's possible to calibrate very subtle shifts in how an object is perceived from different points of view. The slightly off, then, enables a new way of addressing the relationship between the familiar and the unfamiliar. From the 1970s to the 1990s, people would have talked about the uncanny, the strange, and the unfamiliar, which had been coded more explicitly as serving as a form of critique of various social norms, a way to wake people up from their ideological false consciousness in which they were said to be trapped. In this context, architects pursued ideological critique through estrangement and defamiliarization of various sorts. But while in previous decades the formal means of expressing estrangement was through the cutting and slashing of diagonal fragments, now with the manipulation of nerves and lofting and Boolean modeling, it's easier to make uncanny objects in Rhino just simply by twisting and tweaking things to play around with ambiguities. There's any number of forms that might look almost familiar or something like, they might look like something but then not quite be familiar in the end, depending on what angle that you're looking at it from. I want to come back to this topic of the familiar and the unfamiliar in a moment with the final trend of the familiar. But I first want to just talk about a trend which overlaps with the familiar as well as with the material term that we began with. And I'm going to call this one low construction. Aaron Besler and Michelle Chang's work both are good examples of low construction. Aaron Besler's book, Best Practices, looks at what architects would typically think of as the worst examples of amateur construction, and as she puts it, the quote, slapdash handiwork, haphazard paint jobs, and half-hearted do-it-yourself projects. Her book is filled with the photographs that document the so-called bad architecture that she sees around her in Los Angeles streetscape, and that she implicitly argues, she basically argues for this kind of aesthetic as a new aesthetic based on purposefully bad forms and details that could be seen as part of a common language common to the built environment all around us. Her own projects then mannerise this low-budget common domestic construction of stud walls, 2x4s, drywall, moulding, baseboards, and gutters. And this project, called The Entire Situation, as an example, folds out the baseboard trim to make this useless tap of architrave, and it tests the logic of the stud wall in terms of how it can be randomly curved. The way she came to these curves was through an interactive app that she had people in the gallery just wave their finger around and it would automatically produce stud wall. The app is called Stud Finder, and then it produced these very strange stud wall compositions. And Besler's gone on to design small buildings that foreground the construction of how things are made, mannerizing that construction in various ways. Clearly, her work is attempting to cast new light on the ways that everyday Americans engage with houses by doing DIY, and going to Lowe's and Home Depot. And these are some of the many delicate little dollhouse style models she makes of Home Depot's equipment that she then populates around some of her projects as entourage in the photographs. Michelle Chan is more interested really in architectural representation, including drawings, color, patterns, and also things like technical representations, like schedules, pattern books, and instructions to builders. Particularly, she's interested in forms of time-based notation. Her work is informed by Eisenman's process work and his interest in conceptual architecture in the 1970s, as much as it is by the popular and the everyday. So in some respects, her interest in Eisenman and conceptualism, along with populism, don't really go very well together. But she too is interested in low construction. Here's a project called Scoring Building. She derived the construction of this installation from what can be thought of as basically performance art, in which she played with the time-based scheduling of stud walls in a manner that could be likened to perhaps the choreography of Mercer Cunningham, in which the repetition and variation of individual instructions to contractors somehow led to incredibly absurd solutions. This project, called Triptych, explored drywall construction and paper tape, and she was particularly interested in the perceptual effects of these two color palettes. She was also interested in how much you could bend drywall and the cracks that would occur in it as she tried to create curves. So Besler and Chan are not alone in foregrounding low construction. You could add Stan Allen's situated objects and Paul Preisner's American framing, because they've also been foregrounding the way that most homes have been built across America for centuries, on low budgets with stick framing and pitched roofs. So finally, I want to turn now to the last and perhaps maybe the most important trend. That is the trend of the familiar. Or we could say the ordinary, the normal, and even the not interesting, the boring, or the low. So these are some of the architects whose work I want to look at in this section, and just because I haven't written the names of who's made what, this is a slide that also shows you the architects we're talking about. We're still talking about the same kind of group of academic architects around the United States of a relatively younger generation. So these people did these projects. So this seems to be the most important to me, because in it you find the convergence of the concern for legibility, for the normal, which can be registered the slightly off, and for the ordinariness, which can signal low cost, but also low brow and accessibility. A good example of the interest in familiar house types would be this pairing of Clark Tenhouse with Nicole McIntosh and Jonathan Louis. Tenhouse's book, Unresolved Legibility in Residential Types, documents the kinds of cookie-cutter homes built across America by developers. They're the homes that make up most of the residential building stock in America, and are the most desirable homes to own. They've become the principal financial asset of most Americans, and they're the object of fantasy for the American dream. And you can see from the page on the right here, the way Clark seems to manipulate the houses as a mass to make them less easy to resolve in our minds as legible forms. His own designs aim to be just on the edge of what might be appealing to your average client, while also making them strange enough to be noticeably not a cookie-cutter house. In Swissness Applied, Nicole and Jonathan look at forms of the traditional Swiss house, and they chose a town, Glarus, because it had been recreated as a kind of Disneyland-type town in America. It was foregrounding already the way what appears to be authentic and how it's actually not as authentic as you might think. They then designed a series of houses which exaggerate and manipulate this already somewhat cartoonish type, giving them formal play while creating projects they hoped would find a widespread appeal and perhaps a client base and an audience. Then we have another pair of architects which would go together quite well, Andrew Atwood and Paul Prison. They recently came out with books that look at and try to reevaluate our interest in what we might consider to be the not interesting, or quite simply the boring. Atwood's book, called Not Interesting, he redraws uninteresting buildings, in his view, such as gas stations, factories, warehouses that he sees around him, in the same poor contrast, low saturation, painterly style. And by placing them in the book actually alongside many projects that we would consider to be works of great architecture, he levels the difference between the low and the high, questioning the difference between these two kinds of architectural cultures. Atwood then designed buildings that are clearly very interesting. So for example, this building comes out of a decades-long exploration of the forms of the dolmen that he and his design partner, Anna Nemo, have been pursuing in the development of a new abstract language. They've been looking at dolmens all around the world and abstracting the haphazard massing of those forms to create the kinds of projects, installations that then become the house form that we're seeing here. So a lot of work has gone into this, but it also simultaneously looks like all of those cheap mid-century roadside modern buildings that Atwood finds to be not interesting. So his architecture aims at a kind of degree zero language that speaks about its concerns for how architecture is caught up in an economy of attention and spectacle, and how subtly abstracting such ordinary looking buildings is a means to reposition what attention and judgment should look like for us today as architects. Price's book, Kind of Boring, also asks his reader to embrace what he calls indifference, carelessness, normalcy, and dumbness. He too argues that such things can be taken as an antidote to what he calls, quote, the intensification of architectural effects, expense, immediacy, and urgency. I'll give this up. He writes that the, quote, fire hose of interesting things on the internet has produced a cognitive exhaustion, or an exhaustion of tastefulness, that has made him bored with the interesting and as a result, interested in the boring. Boring things for Preissner then become free from spectacle, commodification, expressions of individuality, power, as well as intellectual and moral pretension. He seeks an architectural culture that engages more closely with the amateur and the non-elite ways that the built environment is created, ways that embrace the cheap, the shoddy, the tacky, and the tasteless. And as well as being interested in low construction, we can also refer to another of Michelle Chang's projects here, because she also derives projects from the everyday architecture around her. Here she looked at the big box stores in Virginia, in the state in which she was making an art gallery, and she designed this studio in the region based on typical forms of cladding used in those stores. The form seems familiar, but the skew of one rectangular volume over the other and the lofting of the overhang between them produces something unusual. Here the form is ambiguous, quasi-industrial, quasi-anonymous, hard to recognize, but somehow seemingly common to the urban environment. And finally, perhaps the firm that captures all of these trends best is the work of Moss. Their work embodies several of these contemporary trends. They use discrete elements and deploy them in dumb compositions that are childlike and haphazard. They evoke familiar forms like hitched roofs, chimneys, and carports, but they scale them to make them look slightly off. They refuse the morality of elegant detailing and craft, and instead, everything takes on this overly chunky proportion, and the surfaces tend to be just lap siding. Their aesthetic conveys the idea of being affordable and approachable, yet they represent their buildings in ways that seem weird, strange, or just a little eerie, perhaps. They speak of a low resolution in architecture, hence the exhibition of 44 low resolution houses, that rejects what they think of as the Hollywood sci-fi renderings of slick shapes, which they call high-resolution architecture. And some of their projects even take on characters. If you look here, you can see houses that might look like stick men, or maybe the profiles of ducks with pointed beaks. So, as I said, I've been looking at the work of these young architects situated in academia, whose recent work has already been brought together by various curators and critics. I've tried to look at their work under some of these trends which I've given you, to see what their work means and where some of these trends might come from. And these are not all the trends, of course, in contemporary architecture, just some of them, and just those by some architects. And I find the work interesting, as I said, because it continues the development of new formal or aesthetic agendas in architecture, and because they are linked to larger historical contexts that make them significant, such as the reaction to the economic crash of 2008, responding to changes in the nature of computation, or recalibrating architecture within a political climate of resurgent populism. The work progresses how we think about what is possible in architecture. It especially challenges the way that architecture is caught up in the spectacle of images, and it fosters modes of judgment and attention which ask us to think a bit more carefully and precisely about how we design buildings. So, thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes. To me, it looks like the general trend is to find novelty and to step away from the previous generation. But then again, if you go back in history, you find moments which have revival, for instance. Do you think that there's going to be a moment when we're going to go back, or is like something that is forever lost? And where in time did that happen? if it's true, right? If it's true that we are generation after generation, we just find something new, want to find something novel.
And going back would be going back to parametricism, maybe? Something like that. I mean, probably I've got a Wolframian view of phase swings of styles, basically. I mean, he argued that we went from classical to Gothic and then neoclassical and sort of Baroque, back and forth. And to some degree, probably human culture does have phases of stylistic development that mature, and we inevitably are going to find novelty in the counter swing. So yeah, probably there'll be a counter swing back to, I mean, even now there's an interest in 1990s, early 90s graphics as an aesthetic. And so soon enough there'll probably be an interest in late 90s, early 2000s forms. But I think, and of course, to some degree, some people are carrying on and say that these developments didn't happen, so we have different timelines and different histories. And it's like my dad was wearing glasses that were very unfashionable for 20 years, and all of a sudden they became fashionable, and he didn't even notice they'd gone out of fashion. So it might be that parametricism comes back. I think typically it's probably also a bit of a kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing going on in my head with this, that if this group of people, or got bored basically with this fashion and went back to parametricism, there'd probably be some kind of synthesis, not just a direct return. Does that help? Henry at the back.
Joseph, thank you so much for, as usual, to provoke us with things that are twisted and are very much your own identity. I'll maybe mention to provoke you that I feel there's no conclusion. My colleague maybe offered the conclusion, so I'm kind of left high and dry. So let me just provoke you by saying, would this be something as a potential conclusion to your paper that you could refute or agree? I feel what I learned today is that architecture can no longer sustain itself by itself. It needs books, essays, papers from historians, theorists, essayists, critics, social commentators, bloggers, and you mentioned just 5 minutes ago, academic architects. And it feels that architecture no longer can speak for itself. It has its legitimacy only through books. Would that be something you find right or wrong or refute?
Yeah, and it's a great contribution. I'm not sure that there's a change that's happened. I think the relationship to books and discourses goes at least back to the mid-18th century or something like that, like Piranesi, Ledoux, Goulet. I think architecture's long been, for this kind of trajectory of architecture, like I said, this work is not professional in the typical sense. It's also simultaneously interested in the cultivation of something like an architectural discipline or an architectural culture. And I guess I do think that those things are, the books and drawings and paper projects, videos, all kinds of additional extra architectural things are crucial in the fostering of discipline as something that we would think of as separate from the profession. So I don't think, actually probably my argument is just there's a continuity. And if there was somebody I was arguing against, it would be like the discourse at the end of the theory, that somehow, like in the last 20 years, we've just been in a phase of pragmatism. To some degree, I'm trying to show that there's a continuous tradition of young practitioners that basically never stop thinking of their work, also about larger ideas through speculative work and other things beyond the building. So yeah, that would be my implicit argument. I wouldn't say it's anything recent. I'd say it's probably always be the case.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I agree with you that there is this tradition in the discipline of architecture, of treatises, and then the non-built utopic architecture, but it seems you're demonstrating that there is this obsession now of these books that come from nowhere to start justifying the legitimacy of that. And I feel there is this exaggeration now, this body that no longer has what I think you are absolutely wedded to, this continuity of theory and architecture and history that is now exploding and becoming ultimately whatever people want to write about. And I just have personally a slight issue with that.
I could also add that for many of these practitioners, there's a question that they face that was never really faced by anyone in the 70s, which is how to get tenure. And so these books are often tenure books. And so if you see proliferation of books, you see also like architects trying to satisfy the university. It's very difficult to get tenure based on building buildings. They have very long time spans and they're very unpredictable. So you do a fabrication when you do books. So that's probably fostering what you see as an explosion. Yeah.
So I have a slightly unrelated question to this, but it's related. How do you see Andrew Lynn's lecture that he gave last week regarding DIY architecture and DIY culture, and similar in the sense to the kind of looser with character and the relationships with people that they're doing in certain discreteness. How do you see this regard of academic architects interacting in the future towards that rising culture of DIY architecture and this self-built architecture that is focused on materiality and pragmatically in relation to the unpragmatic?
Yeah, actually after Andrew's lecture, we had a long debate with Edward Becker till about 1 o'clock at night over exactly what we were talking about. And it was quite heated, I have to say. So I think there's a very interesting thing that probably would make a great debate within the school to just have that as a debate. I even wondered to myself whether or not the kind of approach to healthy materials or that he advocates is somewhat antithetical to disciplinary architecture. And it's hard for me to say this in a very short, compressed period of time, so I'm probably going to say something that I'll regret. But I think what constitutes this tradition that I'm talking about is that everything is questioned, even if it's about. I think we talked about the contrast between being good and being interesting. They're not necessarily the same thing. And probably for this group, there's a concern to be interesting more than a concern to be good. So they're willing to suspend a whole range of things that we can take to be moral norms, like good materials, good detailing, truth materials, all kinds of truths in architecture. And they suspend them for the sake of possibilities. That leaves them open to being accused of being immoral, but I think it's more of a suspension of the assumptions about our moral codes for the sake of gaining knowledge and discovering something. I see these as two separate questions. Just last night I was reading that Kant had like 3 basic questions he was interested in, which is what can we know, how should we act, and what can I hope, I'm looking to Frank for help. But he distinguished knowledge, like possibilities of knowledge, from moral action. How can we act? How should we act? As like 2 separate things. That they were like one was about how we relate to nature, and one was about the moral universe. So maybe there's something of that in my mind, that there is a kind of a conflict between morality and knowledge, and I think this group is pursuing a kind of knowledge. It's formal knowledge and aesthetic knowledge, and where it might go in the future. It's probably more akin to technical knowledge. They're like scientists researching something that we can know about architecture. You might have some people in a school of architecture, trying to find out what bamboo can do, or what mass timber can do. And when they set out, they don't know the answer. Right? I mean, scientists come up with things that are potentially evil, like they came up with the atomic bomb. They came up with drugs that went viral and caused a pandemic, viruses that caused a pandemic. So science, to some degree, suspends the moral norm and searches for what's possible. There's probably something of that sort of scientific ethos in this, but it's dedicated not to techniques, like material techniques, but to aesthetic and formal knowledge. Right.
I don't have a microphone. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of the contemporary? For instance, I think a story that probably no one reads anymore, Siegfried Gideon, as you know, talked about the eternal present, which was kind of an interesting formulation. Do you think that the present can no longer be eternal?
I'm going to try and answer your question by assuming that we are talking about his timelessness. Like, can I translate?
Yeah. And also back to the word in your title about what constitutes something being contemporary.
Yeah. I think this is when I say there's a difference between the good and the interesting. I think the interesting is probably tied to a very modern conception of history that we've had since the 19th century, where basically history is constantly moving on and we're constantly restlessly searching as a civilization, as a species. We're restlessly searching for the new. And that makes it hard for us, I think, in our modern condition, to decide to rest on the good and the true, or the beautiful. It's part of the tragedy of modernity, I guess I would say. That we will have fashion cycles, we will have changing knowledge. Our species and society will constantly change. We've let, Pandora, we've let that out of the bag, and we can't put it back, I think. Truths probably are already there. Truths probably are. I wouldn't deny truths or timelessness or the good. It's just that we live in a modern condition where we're subject to history. And so we have to do this difficult dance between this constantly changing contemporaneity and timeless truths that we might seek, but you just don't get timeless truths outside of history, in my opinion.
Yeah. Do you think, last question, getting back to maybe something as simple as a house or not as simple, do you think, I don't know if it's a retreat, but when architects don't know what to do, they make propositions about house. And I think it's kind of interesting. It's one of your trends would be house.
That's a fair point. And it's also these people that, because they don't have major practices and struggle to get clients, it's very difficult to have practice these days in America. The house is kind of the only thing that they can dream of. Maybe it's a house of their parents or a friend. So the house is where a lot, but then in general, I think a lot of great architects, Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, they all started with a house. And they ended up with like mega cities. So maybe it's about just the early phase of the architects as well. There's two more, one at the back, and then
I just remember third year, I had a desk crate with you, and you asked me a question. You were like, "Who's your favorite contemporary architect?" And I couldn't think of one. And it really wasn't until I was exposed to contemporary architecture firms in Europe on my abroad trip last spring that I was able to sort of come up with some answers to that question. Are you at all concerned about this university's kind of separation from these contemporary trends? Because we are quite traditional in that sense.
I asked the same question to my ICR group this year, who were probably in the room. I asked them when we sat down, who were a historical list of contemporary architects. I think it was very difficult. There was like 18 of us in the room. Yeah, I've often, I'll say this out loud to Jim now, I've often been thinking that it would be great to have an introductory course, maybe in the semester next to the history course that begins, which is like the introduction to, not a historical course, but a course, it's like introduction to architectural thinking or something like that, introduction to contemporary architecture. And we don't really have one in the curriculum. It rests on the history class. And I guess I didn't do a great job for 5 years of doing that. I spent too much time with most of history and ran out of speed by the end. I think I had like one lecture or two on the contemporary situation. It might be nice to have an entire class that everyone has to take through their first year, which is just spending a semester looking at contemporary architects. Okay, thumbs up down. And several thumbs up. There's one more question, and we should start.
My question is about trend and discipline. So I see a fundamental difference between these two terms, as trends more or less post a continuity in a set of values, whether you agree or disagree, whereas a new discipline is posting something brand new. And it seems that all the materials you have covered, and probably everything we've been doing in the Western history of architecture, has been these following a set of trends, but not something new, not something brand new. Maybe landscape architecture is some of the new discipline as it have its own judgment in terms of values and what they pursue, which is different from architecture. But would you say there might be a possibility of creating a new discipline in the near future through exploring about these trends? Or are we somewhat just repeating ourselves in terms of value judgment?
Are you saying that among the contemporary trends I showed that there's nothing new?
I wouldn't say there's anything new, but in a way it is still following the set of values we have for the, let's say, traditional architecture. It is still agree or disagree with these values instead of creating its own language somehow.
Yeah. I think, okay, I'm going to try and answer this just by saying that I tend to encourage students to think of contributing to the field as being in dialogue with something that already exists. And so, in academia in general, in other fields, there's a very popular book called They Say, I Say, which teaches people how to write a thesis. And I have something similar in my mind, that what do they say, what somebody already said, and what am I saying in contrast to that? I think it's easier to actually do something new if you understand what already exists. And you offset and clarify what's new about what you're doing in relationship to something that already exists. So I guess that's why, even with this, I gave histories for all these trends that were like 10 or 20 years, or tried to situate where a trend might come from with respect to something it built on. Like, if character built on legibility and legibility built on affect. I'm saying that these discourses birth divergences and new projects out of them, but not as something completely from nowhere. It's probably possible that a genius could be born and come up with something that we're all very interested in that no one's ever thought of. But the chances are really slim, I think. I think more than likely, if you disconnect from the past and stop having a dialogue with it, you end up repeating it unknowingly. That's my opinion on that. Thank you, everybody, very much for coming.